Hey class, here we go finally with our fourth, let me push this up like that, fourth of four lectures, and I've got finals and rough drafts happening in some of my upper division courses, so I'm getting back to you now here to wrap up this little lecture. I hope some of you will have had the interest to come and look and see if this has happened. So let's do a quick review. We began by talking about the heterogeneous nature of Heart Mountain itself, that its geological story as a clip that came crashing off of a larger sheet of bedrock up in the Bighorns or the Beartooths, moving 100 miles an hour, resting out here on the sedimentary ground. It can actually function like a metaphor for how many times Native Americans were broken off of their homelands and sent thundering across our country on trails of tears of 100 different varieties to be relocated out on the settled grounds and really desolate places of the country that was kept being whittled down into Indian territory. But that now we're at a moment in time where these spots are standing as a bit of a landmark, an orienting force for us to consider what does it mean to be at home, what does it mean to belong on this land, that the indigenous presence is in a revitalization moment with its universities, its colleges, its tribal colleges, the creation of tribal constitutions, efforts in legal courts, in educational fields, so that it's a new kind of landmark for all of us, that all of us can use to consider, given 21st century ecological and economic realities, might there be some new relationships to build with the indigenous peoples of this land and restore some of the presence and cultural heritage that was lost during that settler and conquest event that is our history. Went through some of the history of how the Crow territory got whittled down from 33 million acres down to about 3 million now. And then we had moved through some of the Crow cultural story that relates to Heart Mountain, particularly what I've called the first separation. The idea that in their creation story, they have the story about the first time that the link between the Creator and humans got severed. And that was when men rejected the gift of tears. And so the Creator said, nevertheless, if you will show me through your efforts at discipline, and if you will seek me out in the desolate places, if I show you mercy, the gift of tears will allow you the gift of supernatural sight. And with that, if we recall this notion that the Creator's energy is imbued in special places, if one has that gift, one will then be able to see out in the world where the gifts of power and energy reside, and you would be able, through visions, through dreams, through your artifacts, whether it's the color of feather that you should tie, where you should tie it, where it should go on your horse, the what should be in your medicine bag, that these material items will help carry with you some access to that divine power, and a particular Crow sense that they were good at. They were aware of energy at work in the world and good at tapping into it. So the first, here we go more specifically now into why Heart Mountain itself is so special, especially to the kicked in the bellies or away from the center band. One man who received great power from Heart Mountain was Foretop. His story is central to the loosely bounded canon with which the Crow can model their practices. And remember, Grant says, right, because most written traditions have their canons, and everybody has to pay attention to those canons to know what's the right way to behave and how does the church, for instance, feel about something. In this case, their canon comes through the stories of these people who accessed the divine creator's power. So, Foretop is one of those people. It is also a great American story and begins when Foretop was an orphan boy who had no resources. He was dependent on the band for his food, shelter, and clothing. He was called Matted Hair for his scruffy tufts of short, unkempt hair. At this point in the story, we have to step back to the story of a beautiful woman who returned to Matted Hair's band at the time when Matted Hair was becoming a man. She returned after having lived as a captive with the Lakota, so she was over near the Black Hills. Her Lakota husband relented and let her return to her people. She headed off alone across the Black Hills and over the Bighorn Mountains with her infant on a cradle board. Her infant died on the journey, but the infant told her mother, "Keep carrying me, and I will be your guide." When the beautiful woman returned to her band, all the men paraded and danced to try to win her. But the infant spirit counseled the woman to take Matted Hair as her husband. Then the infant counseled Matted Hair to go to Heart Mountain and seek out Baishta Gushte, the gift of tears. He did, and he received great powers from the mountain, including instruction on how to wear his hair in the high pompadour style of a foretop, and to let his hair grow forever and never cut it. Over time, his beautiful hair grew so long he had to wear a backpack to hold it, and all the people called him Foretop. He was a great chief who established many victories and feats of strength, so the people called the mountain Foretop's father, because clearly the mountain had adopted the orphan. So the first separation was caused by men's rejection of the tears. And Foretop is an example of one of those people who overcomes that separation. And the way they label the mountain is quite different from like Carter Mountain or Hayden in Yellowstone or Hayden Valley or so often with settler culture, they named it mountains after themselves. And in this case, the name of the mountain says the mountain and the power in the mountain was in a relationship with the human, and the mountain adopted the human. It's kind of a nice difference. All right, first separation was caused by men's rejection of tears. However, two more ruptures have occurred. The second is the rupture of conquest. The second rupture comes with the impact of consumer and car culture. Do I want to call that the second? Yes, I do. Here we go. The second rupture is with the impact of consumer and car culture, further removing people from abstract and pragmatic dimensions of nature. In this way, people on the reservation and people who live in sight of the mountain, like I do, are tied together by the impacts of macadam, the roads we drive on, in our bodies, as seen by the high rates of obesity and diabetes, both communities having abandoned the art of walking. So here we go through what happens with the second separation. We have, in approximately 1550, the mountain crow arrive in the area. 100 years later, around 1650, the river crow arrive in the area. Around 1700, French trappers misname the crow. So if you can imagine living your life on the American landscape with a name that was a misname that somebody else gave you. For the crow, their name for themselves meant the big beaked bird. The French thought that they were signing for the bird, the crow. It gave them the crow name. That's what they have been stuck with. Part of revitalization, though, you'll see more and more often that the name Apsalica is going to be used on road signs and in cultural presentations, things like that. Between 1620 and 1860, the Crow occupied northern Wyoming and southern Montana, so all of the Bighorn Basin, moving into Yellowstone, moving south towards the Wind Rivers. They would have both friendships and fighting with the Shoshone regarding where territories began and ended. The Blackfeet came down a lot, fighting with the Blackfeet over this area to maintain control here. The Crow were relatively small in numbers compared to these other tribes, and considered fierce in battle. Their ability to have retained such a large area as evidence of how fierce they were. But here's the kind of thing that's hard to fight: how smallpox hit the Crow. As part of this, what I'm reading to you, I'm describing as the second rupture. That in 1782, the Crow suffered from smallpox, went from 20,000 down to 10,000 people. Right, so that first round of smallpox cuts the people in half. I want you to just sit and think what it would mean for half of your people to die in a wave of illness. Then, 1880, another 30 years later, that 10,000 gets reduced down to 5,000, gets cut in half again due to smallpox. Another 20 years later, the number gets cut down by more than half, down to 2,000. And by 1850, the Crow are down to about 1,200 people. Here's a picture of the contemporary Crow world. So they've gone from that 1,000 back up tenfold. Here they are at 11,000 members. 8,000 of those members on the reservation, 80% unemployment with a median income on the reservation of 32,000. 80% of them speak Crow. That is a phenomenally high number. And in terms of revitalization efforts, that sparks remarkable hope and has a bigger foundation for developing educational curriculum and keeping the language going than many tribes experience. So that's a huge sign of hope. In 2001, they passed their own constitution. They're developing their own tribal justice system. This image on this slide, I'm probably in the middle of the image, but for those of you who remember the floods of 2011, that's what the town of Crow Agency looked like after those floods. Indigenous people, I believe the book speaks to this, are going to experience the impacts of climate change first and most with the greatest volatility because of how often their lives are going to depend on food resources from the land, how often they have been settled in areas that will be vulnerable. And so whether we are talking about Native Americans in the United States or indigenous people in Africa, they will be hit harder and have fewer of the structural resources to respond to the volatility of climate change. That's part of what we're going to keep hearing about. So to respond to this crisis of diminished energy and separation, Grant and I worked with Sharon Cahan and together with the Nature Conservancy, a professional videographer, and the hospitality of the local Episcopal Church congregation, and in June 2011 created a potluck supper with a seminar from Crow participants on Friday night. And at that potluck, then, we exchanged gifts with elders, representatives who were helping to organize the ceremony. And then on the Saturday, we had a pipe ceremony that included all the members of this alliance. So people from the Episcopal Church, Nature Conservancy, and the tribe, whose common ground was respect for Crow heritage on the mountain and the preservation of Crow heritage and appreciation of the power of the mountain. Right? So Nature Conservancy can share in wanting to preserve that. And so in this case was the local Episcopal congregation.